the River Basin management class that we teach here at Utah State University. The class focuses nearly all on Colorado River, and students in the class are using the Colorado River simulation system model to ask questions and answer questions related to management. And I think one of the things to keep in mind in this course, the main learning objective is for students to be able to write technically sound and politically sophisticated analysis of Colorado River problems and to share insights related to that. So we've also obviously opened the guest visit to the broader public. We have people from other students and faculty from Utah State University, as well as guests and friends and partners from around the basin. It's really good to see everyone. There were two read ahead items ahead of the presentation, and this just follows a flipped model of education, which is new, where come to class having already read the material so that we can do a more in-depth discussion to really get into the nuance and the complexity and interest. And Carrie's going to post the reference or the links to Anne's resignation letter, which came in January, and also to the memorandum of understanding between the Upper Colorado River Commission and several tribal nations. So Anne's going to start with about 4 to 5 slides of kind of opening remarks. I'll follow up with some questions. Then we'll open the questions up to students in the class. And finally, or then after, if we have time, we'll allow questions from the rest of you. And if you have a question anytime, please put that into the chat and I'll be drawing on those to answer. And last, we'll finish with a 3 to 4 minute closing. And we'll try and be out of here by 2:30. Okay, and maybe you could start off with just explaining why there's a U.S. commissioner to the Upper Colorado River Commission and what that person does or what they're responsible for.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, let me say thanks for your interest, everybody who's with us this afternoon. I see students and I see some old friends. So thanks for being here. The commissioner, the federal commissioner on the Upper Colorado River Commission goes back to the 1948 Upper Basin Compact that created the commission in the first place. So that compact was mainly about allocating among the Upper Basin states, so Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, allocating their share, the Upper Basin share of Colorado River water among those 4 states. But it also, in order to kind of administer that allocation, the 1948 compact created a commission to oversee the operations in the Upper Basin. And the commission has 5 members, 1 commissioner from each of those Upper Basin states, and 1 federal commissioner that's appointed by the president if he so chooses. And if there is a federal commissioner, that person is the chair of the Upper Colorado River Commission. So the state commissioners obviously are there to represent the interests of their states and to make sure that they're getting their fair allocation of Upper Basin water and to deal with the lower basin states and their principles. I saw the federal commissioner's role as being broader, looking at the overall interests of the Upper Basin and how that fit into the bigger Colorado River system. And I think also I felt it was my responsibility to sort of embody the federal trust responsibility to the Upper Basin tribes. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Great. Do you want to bring up your slides for talking?
Sure. You want me to jump right in?
Yeah, let's go for it. We've had some more people join in, and it's great to see everyone. And I should just also add, my name is David Rosenberg. I'm a professor here at Utah State University in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I also have a joint appointment at the Utah Water Research Lab.
So David and I have been talking about what you've learned already in this class about the Colorado River operations and some of the issues. I thought I would start by focusing today on the post-2026 guidelines process and talk about kind of current events, what the timeline is that we're operating under, the negotiations that are currently going on among the basin states and the Department of the Interior, and what some of the difficulties are, what the hurdles are to reaching a consensus about how to operate the river when the existing guidelines expire. So first of all, the timeline. And I got to warn you, I'm going to work backwards because that's the only way we can figure out where we are right now. And this is all based on the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, because obviously putting into place a new operating regime for the Colorado River system is a major federal action. So it requires analysis of environmental impacts under NEPA, and NEPA's got some requirements for timelines. So first of all, we know that we have to be done by August of next year, 16 months from now. And the reason that's the case is because we look at existing water levels in the reservoirs and forecasts of water levels and inflow. We do that in August, looking at the next January 1st. Now, that's the way the current rules operate, and maybe it'll be different when we have a new operating system. But what we know right now is that by August of 2026, we need to know how we're going to operate starting in January of 2027. So we're working backwards from that pretty firm deadline. So we have to have a record of decision. That's what will implement or establish the new operating regime. And that record of decision will come from the Secretary of the Interior. There is, under NEPA requirements, NEPA guidelines, a 30-day waiting period after a final environmental impact statement is issued before you can issue a record of decision. So working backwards, if we have a record of decision or a ROD in August, we have a 30-day waiting period. So we will have had to have a final environmental impact statement in July. And I should say that all of this NEPA stuff is based on guidelines that were issued by the Council on Environmental Quality to govern how NEPA works in all the federal agencies. And those guidelines were just kind of undermined or invalidated by a federal court that said last fall that CEQ didn't have the authority to tell the executive branch departments and agencies how to do NEPA. So we're a little bit in a void right now because all of the different departments are supposed to do their own guidelines on how to do NEPA, and we don't have them yet for all of the departments. So what I'm telling you is sort of general stuff that could change and might not hold even right now, but we're kind of operating in a little bit of a void. But anyhow, based on what we know now, the final EIS, which we have to have by July of next year, has to address all the comments that are given on a draft EIS. And a draft EIS has to contain the complete environmental impact analysis. So one thing that we'll look at really hard is it will have to model the hydrological impacts of all the different alternatives that are being considered under NEPA as potential new operating regimes. So that hydrological model is kind of what we think mostly about when we're anticipating an EIS. But there's a whole lot more than that that has to be analyzed, because each of the alternatives, and it's my understanding that the students in David's class have reviewed Reclamation's alternatives report, which laid out in a great amount of detail the various proposals that Reclamation is going to be analyzing as alternative operating regimes. That report came out in January. So they're doing the hydrological modeling on those alternatives, but they also have to look at impacts on water quality, on air quality, cultural resources, recreation, power, biological resources, meaning critters, um, and economics, socioeconomics. I mean, there's this whole list of different resources that have to be analyzed for each alternative in a draft EIS. Part of that analysis has in the past been impacts on environmental justice and impacts on Indian trust assets. It's unclear to me whether that will continue to be part of an environmental impact analysis in the current administration. Don't know. But that has traditionally been looked at as part of an EIS. So my point here is that a draft EIS is a really thorough and lengthy and complex document, and we don't have that yet. It was originally promised to be issued in December of last year. It wasn't, and we don't have it yet. And once we get it, there is a notice and comment period that is a minimum of 30 days. But given the complexity of this particular EIS, I would anticipate a longer comment period to allow people to understand what has been analyzed, what the impacts are, and how the various different alternatives will affect them. So we'll have this notice and comment period after a draft EIS, and then all of the comments have to be addressed somehow, either incorporated or reasons given for not incorporating them into that final EIS. And that is a process that's going to take Reclamation a while. So again, backing up all of these different timelines, we're kind of out of time for proposing any different alternative. But the whole idea is that the ideal situation would be if the 7 basin states are able to come to a consensus about what the next operating regime ought to look like, and provide at least a framework of that consensus to Reclamation that could be incorporated into a draft EIS as an alternative of its own. And I guess the bottom line is, if we want that to happen, it's got to happen really quickly, like maybe in a month from now, because otherwise there's just not enough time to do all the analysis that needs to be done. So that's kind of the timeline. Then I want to talk about how those negotiations are going. So Reclamation, like I said, published its alternatives report in January, and it identified 4 action alternatives. And the reason we say action alternatives is because there's always a no action alternative, which is it's usually the status quo, but in this case, it's not quite the status quo, because the regime that we're operating under right now is based on a record of decision from 2007 and a bunch of agreements and deals with Mexico, all of which expire at the end of next year. So No action means that we go back to what was in existence prior to 2007. And that is, I guess, in a word, not much, because there was, we have the compact. We know what the 1922 compact tells us. We have some guidance from the 1968 Colorado River Basin Project Act, and um, and the set of long range operating criteria that were generated as directed by that 1968 act. But that all happened in, like 1970 originally. It was a different river then, and the population and uses were different. So the no action alternative reverts back to that really old stuff, and it is far from what we need, both in terms of detail and in terms of dealing with the river we have today, the depleted river caused by climate change. So that's no action. Then there's 4 action alternatives. Reclamation had asked people to submit alternatives, and they got a bunch of proposals, including one each from the lower basin and the upper basin. In this report that you guys have seen, none of the proposals that were submitted to reclamation were adopted in whole cloth. What they did was they kind of picked and chose and created hybrid alternatives from several of the submissions, and also constructed an alternative that Reclamation and the Department of the Interior believe that they have the existing authority to impose and implement. So there's the first alternative called federal authorities, which is what I just described. That's what Reclamation thinks it can do without additional authority. The other 3 would require additional authority. Congress would have to act and tell Reclamation and Interior that they could do certain things in order to be able to implement these alternatives. And both the lower basin and the upper basin have objected to the alternatives being analyzed because their submissions, their proposals were not adopted in full. So if we go back to the end of last year at the Colorado River Water Users Association conference, which is an annual conference in Las Vegas, where a whole bunch of people go who are interested in the Colorado River. They usually have a panel at that conference with all the principals from the 7 basin states, and they talk about kind of where they are in their thinking about what the next operating regime should look like, what some of their specific state issues are, where the controversies are. The rift between the upper basin and the lower basin this past year was such that they didn't even have a 7-state panel. They had separate panels, one for the upper basin, one for the lower basin. And there was an apparent rift between the representatives of the 2 basins in where they thought their interests were and what the other guys were saying. So it was uncomfortable to watch, but it was apparent that things were not going well in terms of negotiating and reaching a consensus. That seemed to change in January, where some meetings were held. They appeared to be more productive. The states, upper basin and lower basin, seemed to be able to reach agreement on some basic principles, and identify the areas where they had to figure things out further. So we kind of got things back on track. The basin state principals scheduled something like 9 meetings between mid-January and mid-May to really get after it, really try to work and come up with a consensus framework and deal with the deadlines that we were just talking about. However, events after January have made it harder. And there has been more of a rift, again, apparent between the upper basin and the lower basin. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what are the hurdles of getting to a consensus agreement? I think timing is one of them. I mean, we've seen how short the timeline is now. And some of the issues involved there are, it's not just 7 principals coming to an agreement about how to operate the system. We've got legislatures that are involved. We have governors who want to have a say. There are members of Congress who are very interested in how these things are going. And so just as an example, the Arizona legislature would have to approve any agreement among the states that would provide for future operations. And they're not in session now. They'll be in session again next year. But, you know, a lot of discussion has to happen. You don't want to present an agreement just cold to a legislative body. You have to have a lot of preparation for that kind of thing. So timing is a big issue. There's a lot of pressure because of timing. Also, in February, the lower basin states send a letter to the Secretary of the Interior that, to put it candidly, really pissed off the upper basin because it suggested that the new Secretary of the Interior should throw out the alternatives report that had just been published the month before by Reclamation and start over. And that the lower basin alternative in its unaltered form should be considered as one of the action alternatives. So that has not helped and is having some lasting effect, I think. Also, we've got the freezing of federal funding, particularly in the funding coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, $4 billion targeted primarily at the Colorado River Basin to help smooth the way to operating this system, which is now out of balance between supply and demand, to smooth the way to operate it in a sustainable manner. So federal funding was helping to kind of sweeten the pot for the reductions in usage that were going to be required. So we don't know. There's indication that at least some of that federal funding will be unfrozen. As far as I know, dollars are not yet flowing to the people, even people who had obligated contracts for water conservation that was going to be funded through the IRA money. So that's a problem. And another problem is we don't have leadership within the Department of the Interior. Obviously, the secretary is in place, but there's no commissioner of reclamation and no nominee for commissioner of reclamation. There is a nominee for the assistant secretary for water and science at Interior who plays a role in these discussions, but she hasn't been confirmed yet. There is an acting assistant secretary for water and science that I understand is has become somewhat active, but acting positions are different than being the person Senate confirmed sit in that office and don't have the same level of authority. I'll just say it that way. So the Department of the Interior, the Commissioner of Reclamation can play a role in kind of browbeating the states into coming to a consensus and if we only have actings and the secretary is focused on other stuff, as they normally are, it makes it harder for the states to come together. And then the last thing I'll say about a hurdle is the state principals and the biggest players, decision makers in this system are all really smart, really talented, very experienced people. And their job is to represent their constituency. So the principal for the state of Utah, Gene Shawcroft, it's his job, it's his responsibility to make sure that Utah is getting a fair share and to be frank, maximizing Utah's share of Colorado River water. That kind of constituent pressure works against compromise, makes compromise much more difficult. And everybody's working to maximize their benefit, and that's what they're supposed to do. That's the way we've set up the system, but it makes it difficult to compromise because you then have to go back to your constituents and say, well, we gave up some water and it's your water. And we think we have pretty good legal arguments about why it's your water and why you should get to keep it. But we've decided to make a deal to use less. That's hard. And so I see that as one of the hurdles, certainly, and maybe even the most difficult. So the last thing I'll say on this particular thread is here's where we are hydrologically. The projected inflow to Lake Powell this year, and the inflow comes in mostly in April through July. So that's the runoff season. That projected inflow is 2/3 of normal. And that's based on precipitation during this water year so far. So from October 1 to like yesterday is at 91% of average. So this illustrates the growing disconnect that we have between precipitation and runoff. And that there's a lot of factors involved there, but it used to be, back in the previous century, that precipitation and runoff were about equal. But that's just not the case anymore. We can have a perfectly average snowpack year and still be at this kind of, 2/3, 70% of normal inflow. And that is part of what's motivating this new set of guidelines. We have to be able to deal with scenarios like that and even worse. So you can see the impact of these reduced inflows in reservoir conditions. The graph on the right shows total storage in the basin, and the orange line is Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two largest reservoir components of the system. And this starts at the beginning of the 21st century, and you can obviously see it's a downward trajectory. We had good years in 2011, we had a good year in 2023, but we don't have the system in balance. So we can have a good year, we go up a bit, but then we continue to draw down the reservoirs because on average, we use more than Mother Nature supplies. So we're getting close to critical conditions again. Both the lakes are at about 1/3 capacity. And that is a little bit misleading because when you say 1/3 capacity, that includes the part of the reservoirs that we can't get to, what we call dead pool. So it's really the usable amount of water in these reservoirs is actually less than 1/3. And that's too close for comfort. So another pressure on the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation and the states to figure this out pretty quick. The very last thing I'll say is it's my understanding that, the states, like I said, they set up all these meetings, they have been meeting. There was a meeting last week, and I'm told that the acting secretary for water and science told the basin states that they better figure it out really soon, because the Secretary of the Interior has a lot of power to implement his own solution. And that is true, but I think that it also represents the sort of muscular perception of executive power that is emblematic of this administration. And so we'll see how that all works out. But I guess the bottom line is time is short.
Great. And so are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to follow up for those of you who came in a bit late. I'm going to follow up with a few questions. We're then going to move to questions from students in the class, and we'll finish with questions from the wider audience. And so if you have a question at any time, type it into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that and feeding questions back to Anne. So Anne, I'm wondering, first of all, the dialogue, the differences between the upper and basin and lower basin states is pretty clear. And this has been going on for a long, long time, decades, with several agreements amongst them in place as well. So what happens if there's no deal amongst the basin states? Kind of what's that path look like?
Yeah, and I think the meeting that happened with the representative of the Department of the Interior last week is an indicator that Interior is willing to use that authority. The best indication of what that would look like is, I think, in the federal authorities alternative that is part of what Reclamation is analyzing now. So we've seen what that is. It's in the environmental, it's in the EIS report, the alternatives report that Reclamation published in January. So we know it would include deeper reductions in allowable use in the lower basin. It would include a conservation pool in Lake Powell that would be filled with contributions of saved water in the upper basin states. That under current authorities cannot be mandated because the Interior just doesn't have the authority to kind of reach up into the upper basin and require curtailment of water in order to be able to fill a conservation pool. And it would have specific rules for the operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead that would protect infrastructure at Lake Powell. So it wouldn't allow Lake Powell to go below a certain level, because if it does, there are threats to the dam itself and the outlet tubes that are used to release water below certain levels. So it's got a lot of operational detail. Reclamation believes it has that authority right now to implement that. So that is a pretty good picture of what it looks like if the states can't come to an agreement.
So, I mean, that really helps kind of clarify right where we're at now. You've talked about a pretty dire situation that's facing us right now, and I want to turn maybe back to some of the successes that we've seen, and including one that you've been very a part of. It's part of your interest, which is advancing tribal water interests. And so one of the recent successes from my perspective was the memorandum of understanding between the Upper Colorado River Commission and several tribal nations of the Upper Basin. Could you just maybe talk about how that came to be? Kind of which things led to that being I think a pretty remarkable change in how tribes were engaging in the basin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's both interesting and something to celebrate, really. The Upper Basin commissioners, and I should say that there was a long gap in the federal commissioner position on the UCRC from about 2018 to 2022. Um, when the previous federal commissioner, Felicity Hannay, was asked to resign. She had been appointed by President Obama 10 or so years before. She was asked to resign during the first Trump administration, and really no one else was appointed. There was a guy appointed at the very end of Trump 1.0 after the election of President Biden, but before he was inaugurated. But he didn't last long, and I think never chaired a meeting. Anyhow, long gap. Um, so the four state commissioners had been working since, I would say, early 2022 to increase the involvement of the tribes and increase information sharing between the state principals, the state commissioners, and the six Upper Basin tribes. And I give great credit to Becky Mitchell, the Colorado commissioner, for instigating that that dialogue, and all the other state commissioners as well. They have consistently made the time to meet with tribes and more completely understand the tribal issues and just to establish relationships between the state principals and their advisors and the tribal leaders and their advisors. So meetings started in the summer of 2022. I was appointed in September of 22. We continued that process. We would have meetings about in-person meetings about every 2 months, virtual meetings in between, a lot of discussions about what the tribes wanted to see, needed to see in the next set of operating guidelines, what some of their issues were outside of the context of the operating guidelines. And in 2023, we decided that it made sense to memorialize that process in a written document, in a memorandum of understanding, so that those discussions would continue regardless of who was sitting in the chairs of either the state commissioners or the tribal leaders. So we worked on a memorandum of understanding, and it was fully executed at an amazing ceremony in the Hickory Apache Nation in April of last year. So right around a year ago. And so now we have this memorandum of understanding, and it does several things. It commits to pursuing shared goals and priorities, and that's a big deal, that the tribes and the states were going to join together to advocate for certain things. And those goals were derived from an earlier document that we called the framework document that was reached in 2022. One of the major provisions in one of these shared goals is a greater tribal role in decision-making around Colorado River management. The decision-making process has historically really been the states together with the Department of the Interior. Tribes have not historically been involved, and they weren't involved certainly in the compact or in some of the federal legislation. They weren't even really involved in the 2007 guidelines. So relatively recent history, but that is something that the Upper Basin states and tribes wanted to change. So a greater role in decision making, and advocacy for compensation to the tribes for the unused or undeveloped component of their decreed tribal water rights. And that's a huge deal, because if you just think about the way that Western water works, it's all based on use, exploitation, development. All of the legal systems are based on water use. And the tribes have quite correctly pointed out that they have settlements or decrees that give them a quantum of water that they are entitled to. And the reason they're entitled to it is because we have Supreme Court guidance that when reservations of land were reserved for the tribes, that included implicitly a reservation of the amount of water required to fulfill the purposes of the land reservation. So they're owed that amount of water by virtue of their agreement, the tribe's agreement to give up ancestral lands, and take in exchange the reservation lands. And that comes with a quantum of water. The tribes, in many cases, haven't been able to fully develop or use that full decreed water right. And the way they see it, and they're not wrong about this, is, if they developed half, the other half of an upper basin tribal water right is flowing down through the system, getting to the lower basin. And right now, lower basin water users are being compensated for not using that water. And the tribes get nothing. So that issue, compensation for unused tribal water, is the number one issue, I would say, of the upper basin tribes. And even though it is a difficult kind of psychological leap for upper basin state water types to think about compensation for something you haven't used, they were able to see the unique nature of the tribal water rights and get behind a shared goal of pursuing compensation for that component. So that's a really important part of the MOU. So that was fully executed in April a year ago, and it continues to be implemented, meetings every couple of months, and discussions, information sharing, but also discussions about strategy and how to achieve those shared goals.
I think you nailed it right? The compensation for unused water is a really huge and unresolved issue. I want to turn the time now over to students in the class. Each of them came prepared with 4 to 6 questions, but we'll keep things to one. And Annabelle, would you like to go first? You can also introduce yourself to everyone as well.
Okay, can you guys all hear me?
Yep, great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm Annabelle. I'm studying environmental engineering here at Utah State. And yeah, my question, I just thought of a question while you were presenting, and I was wondering how, I know you kind of said how the tribal nations in the basins could collaborate more, but I'm wondering how to increase trust and collaboration between the upper basin and the lower basin, because from what I've seen, that's a big source of conflict.
Yeah. Well, I think in a lot of ways, the Colorado River system runs on relationships. And historically, the relationships among the state principals, the heads of major water utilities, big irrigation districts, they've been pretty good. We all understand the problems, and and there's a recognition that smart people can disagree, and in some cases have to disagree based on what I was talking about before, the representation of their constituencies. I think that the information sharing, the bi-monthly meetings, the virtual meetings that the Upper Basin states have been having with the Upper Basin tribes, that has made me hyper aware of the importance of relationships, because, now I know who's got kids playing soccer and whose mother is sick, or whose father just died, or who's going through difficulties in their relationships. When you know that kind of stuff about people, it makes the discussions that you have different. I I think that's been very successful in the Upper Basin context. That's not missing between the basin states. Those people all know each other, and they have for years in many cases. Um, but I think it's so difficult. The situation that we're faced with now is we've got this math problem, this imbalance between supply and demand. We can't control the supply. We can only control the demand. So everybody has to use less, and it's allocating that burden of reductions in use that is the crux of the issue. And it's just really hard to not use water that you have used for many, many years in the past, and you've got investments based on the availability of that water. So, I think the political pressures are difficult, and little things that you might just find annoying in a different context can really blow up in this sort of high pressure situation. So I don't have an answer to your question, Annabelle, but I think you're right that relationships are key. It's just that they can only go so far. They can only help you. I guess they can't necessarily get you to a really difficult compromise.
Okay, that clears things up for me. Thank you.
Anybody else? You're on mute, David.
Oh, Riza.
Okay, thank you for your informative presentation. I have a couple of questions, but I go first with one of my major questions. You mentioned about the runoff efficiency in Colorado River Basin. In the last 2 decades, we have same amount of precipitation, but less runoff. And my question is, to what extent do you believe it's mainly about climate change or other factors like groundwater withdrawal for municipal uses can affect this runoff efficiency and water yield for the Colorado River Basin?
Yeah, good question, Riza. And you guys are the engineers. I'm not an engineer, but
Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rosenberg graduate student in civil and environmental engineering. Yeah,
okay, yeah,
sorry
I
about
kind
that.
of. So the climate change impacts are pretty pervasive. Like you're suggesting, they don't explain the whole issue of reduced flows, but they explain a big part of it. And it's because there's a lot of things to think about. If we have a warmer climate, then we've got shorter winters and a longer growing season. So the natural vegetation is sucking up more water than it would have previously. We have greater evaporation because of that longer or warmer atmosphere. Evaporation from the streams themselves, from the surface of reservoirs, but also evaporation from the ground that depletes the soil moisture. So more of the water is going to refill the soil moisture reservoirs than would have happened previously. We have greater demand. If you're irrigating a lawn, you've got greater growing season, it's hotter, you need to put more water on it. Same in the ag sector. So then there's sublimation, you know, and I'm now kind of out of my element, but there's a lot of different climate change impacts that result in reduced runoff. You're absolutely right that there are other causes as well, like groundwater depletion, you know, human caused groundwater depletion. And that definitely can make a difference. It's my understanding that that particular cause is not a huge factor in the reduced runoff in the Colorado River system specifically. Not to say it's not a factor at all, but that it is overwhelmed by the climate change impacts. That's kind of about as far as I could go with answering your question.
Thank you.
It's also, I would add, and amazing how these things are troubling, how these different factors are changing over the last decade or two that are further exacerbating the issue right now. Collins, you're next. Would you like to go?
Absolutely. Just introduce myself. My name's Colin Stevenson. I'm also a graduate.
Can't hear you very well,
Yeah, can
Collins.
you turn up your volume?
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, my apologies. As I was saying, my name's Colin Stevenson. I'm also a graduate student here at USU. And I actually just had a question that came to mind as you were discussing more in depth some of the alternatives being considered currently. And this may be requires some speculation on your part, and I understand that there's definitely limits to speculation, so feel free to answer or don't answer. In considering the potential for the alternative to be decided at a federal level, if the lower and upper basin states aren't able to come to a decision on an alternative, it's my understanding that one of the things that goes into like some of the political pressures is that there's not really a consensus on how to split shortages once they get past a certain amount, how to distribute those shortages among the states. And I was just curious, is there any historical mode of enforcing shortages at either the basin states or the federal level? And if there's not, is there any idea of what that enforcement might look like if those states aren't currently able to decide or come to a consensus on how to split those shortages?
Yeah, we do have a track record of at least a partial track record here in splitting shortages, specifically among the lower basin states. So the Secretary of the Interior is empowered, and he or she is the water master in the lower basin. He's empowered to determine whether there is sufficient water to satisfy all the contracts for water delivery that people in the lower basin have, or entities in the lower basin have, with the Secretary. And the Supreme Court decision of Arizona versus California that we got in the 1960s told us Secretary is the water master. In order to get deliveries of water from Lake Mead or the Colorado River main stem in the lower river, you must have a contract with the Secretary. So Secretary gets to determine whether there is sufficient water to deliver, to fulfill all those contracts. And if there isn't, then the Secretary can make decisions about how much water is available to fulfill those contracts. And then that decrease is distributed among the contracts for water delivery in the lower basin. So we know that that can happen, and has been happening over, well, since that's kind of part of what's in the 2007 interim guidelines, is provision for delivery reductions in deliveries based on Lake Mead elevations. And the way you worded your question was interesting, because it made me think about when the 2007 guidelines were being negotiated and set out, the reductions in deliveries were based on various elevations at Lake Mead, starting at elevation 1075, there's some reductions, 1050, more reductions, 1025, even more. But that's as far as it got, was elevation 1025 in Lake Mead, which is pretty low, but it's not all the way down to the bottom. And so you might say, well, why didn't you provide for, elevation 1000? And it was because they couldn't agree. They could only go so far, because looking at reductions greater than what was eventually provided for at elevation 1025, they just couldn't agree how to split them up. So there's always that element too. You go as far as you can go. And like I said, these reductions are really, really hard, especially in Arizona. So sometimes it's not that the authority doesn't exist. It just is that we couldn't come to agreement at those very severe levels. As between the upper basin and the lower basin, we don't have a track record, because they're the only authority that could be used to reduce usage in the upper basin in times of hydrological shortage. The only authority we really have is from the 1922 compact, that has the provision that the upper basin states can't cause the flows at Lee Ferry to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over 10 years. That's it. And the upper basin states take the position that they're not causing flows to drop below 75 million over 10. Now that hadn't happened yet, but we're on a trajectory to get there. But their position, their legal position, is they're not causing that to happen. Climate change is causing that to happen. And so they don't have any obligation to reduce use in the upper basin. That's hotly contested. But going along with your question, we don't have historical examples of how to do that. And in terms of federal authority, certainly the upper basin states take the position that the Secretary of the Interior has absolutely no authority to reach up into upper basin tributaries and shut off water rights. So that is a seminal issue. And I guess, if the states are able to come to agreement, and there is a voluntary agreement that says the upper basin states will reduce usage in this manner, or contribute X amount to a conservation pool in Lake Powell, that's great. If that doesn't happen, the only way I see that being resolved is through litigation about what the compact means. And nobody wants that.
Yeah, that whole issue is really thorny. So we're a few minutes over here. We're not going to have time to take questions from the general audience, but one thing that we do in class often or sometimes is kind of get a pulse of the room. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'd like everyone to put into the chat why, oh, sorry, I'm sharing, stop sharing. Share in this pretty dire situation, why I have hope for the Colorado River, and also new insights or new insight that I took away from today's discussion. And Anne, I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts on the first question of why we should have hope.
It's a really good question. It makes you think about so many different aspects of what we've been talking about today and what's involved in these discussions around a new operating regime. I have hope because we have a record of collaboration, a historical record of collaboration in this basin. And we have been able in the past to reach agreement on stuff that was really hard. Not as hard as what we're doing now, but hard. And I think that that's different from other basins. The Colorado River system has been celebrated for being able to reach agreement, collaborate, and be able to move forward based on that agreement. So that is one thing that gives me hope. I also think, this is all about using less water and who's going to use how much less. We have to use less water. We can't use water that doesn't exist. The river is not giving us the water that it used to give us. So we will use less water. The real issue is, are we going to control how that's allocated, or is it just going to happen due to chaos in the system or be imposed by the federal government? And I think that at the end of the day, all of our water users and our representatives would favor more control than letting somebody else decide our future for us.
Great. So again, if you want to share why you have hope for the Colorado River, please put that into the chat. We as a class will be happy to gather those up and share that back out soon afterwards. And also, if you have new insights that you took away from the talk today, this would be really great for us and also Anne to be able to see. And again, we would compile those and put those in. So please use the chat. We're going to finish here. I'd like all of us to thank Anne using any physical or emoticon that you can use to express your thanks. And we here at Utah State University, I asked Anne this question beforehand: which do you prefer, ice cream or chocolate? And chocolate was the resounding answer. So we'll be sending some Aggie chocolate. Utah State University is a land-grant institution. We have a animal science program. And one of the things they produce is chocolate. So we'll be getting that to you, Anne. And at this point, I would again like to see just a expression of gratitude that, Anne, you were amongst a very busy schedule. You're able to find an hour and 7 minutes to share with us.
You're quite welcome. My pleasure.
So again, please use the chat, and we want to thank everyone for coming. And for those in the course, Collins, Annabelle and Riza, can you just stay on for a few more minutes and we'll finish up?
Okay. Good luck all. See ya.